I said, there were still a few, but they're retiring and they're leaving as there's still a few that were around in the early 2000s. Um, uh, Two things on that I like to talk about is one is the behavior analysts that still were doing stuff moved into residentials. And there used to be a journal. It's now called Behavioral Intervention. It was Richard Fox's journal. Before that, it was called Behavioral Residential Treatment. And he has always kept a good focus on behavior analysis in these kind of residential programs. And he's always had for publishing there. The other one is Teaching Family Homes, which a lot of people remember Achievement Place. That was one of Montrose's Wolf's things. Well, Teaching Place, Achievement Place, became an entire series of homes. And Bernstein published an article on that in the old Behavior Analyst Today, which you can find on the APA website if you search. But Bernstein talked about the 297 replications of the Teaching Family Home and how successful that's been. And they used a combination. They used different things. Mostly they had their chips and dip program, which was like a token economy program, but they also used a level system that was behaviorally based. And they're still around today, Teaching Family Homes. They got kind of a bad rap. There was a period in corrections itself called the Why Nothing Works period.
Right. Right. Off a famous article of that name, right?
Right. Why Nothing Works. And some of this was, remind me to talk about Cohen and Philpatrick in a minute, but some of this, if you think about it, was that behavior analysts who were not very statistically savvy and who were very smart people, Montrose Wolf, I wish I could do half of what Montrose Wolf does. But when he was doing some of the initial outcome data, he took at some of the homes that had completely fallen apart, right? Not because of anything that was wrong with the model, but because of the teaching parents that they had, and used them in his final outcome data. So you were using outcome data of completely collapsed homes, which might have been better to kind of say these are outliers. Let's do an outlier analysis of why they were, and then look at it. So a man named Kingsley, who was really behaviorist who was working at that point, did what was called a Cox proportional regression analysis. First, he did an article for the Behavior Analyst Today on a review of the literature and the current thinking, why the old wisdom is not true about these teaching family homes. And then he did a follow-up article on the Cox, using this Cox proportional regression analysis, which is a statistical analysis, and showed that they actually have a fairly large effect size. So the Teaching Family Association still exists today. You could still get certified in teaching family. That's, by the way, something I've been telling people to do, and I've actually done that with my own company. As a lot of people know, I own Behavior Analysis and Therapy Partners. We treat children in Bala Cynwyd and in Philadelphia, Montgomery, and Bucks County. So we're actually a very large company. We just signed a contract to do high schools in Philadelphia, where we're doing behavioral interventions in the high school, and we're dovetailing with the school's positive behavior support programs. Well, one of the things I wanted to do is, these are high school kids. So I said, well, look, high school kids, one of the big things with high school kids is drug and alcohol problems. Let's go. Bob Myers is retired. Nate Azerin had this program called Community Reinforcement Approach. And Bob's kind of pushed it out to community reinforcement and family training. He inherited that whole line of treatment. He became the trainer for adolescent CRA. I said, let's hire Bob to come in, do a training for our staff, 40 hours, certify everybody in community reinforcement and community reinforcement, what's now called adolescent community reinforcement approach. Community reinforcement approach, a very powerful approach. It's built on a functional analysis. It's Nate Azerin's program. It takes care of what they used to call as thinking factors. Now they refer to them as cognitive factors. by using them as an antecedent. It doesn't take them as causal. It takes them as antecedent variable. So you might be responding to an emotion you're having.
Mm-hmm.
And it does a standard functional assessment using that model, and then trains it's a self-control training, trains the participant to turn around and to stay clean. It's got a lot of research support, but these are things that I don't know if there's an heir to the community reinforcement and family training model, or an heir to the adolescent ACRA. So when these guys die, or they retire, hopefully not for a long time to come yet, but they're in their 70s, you're not going to have it anymore. These will be items lost to ABA after they go. So either you invite them to do seminars and trainings, you get people interested in doing it. If you have an agency, you seek these kind of contracts and use them for training now, so you can establish a goal in it. Bye-bye. And these were some strong evidence-based treatments. And so that's what happens.
I feel like there's a pattern here of some really good work that's been done, and it's like you described, it's almost gotten forgotten, or there's just a few people that have a lot of knowledge, but they're on in years, it's toward the end of their career, when it should be growing and expanding, which is, sure. You were part of a webinar recently on we call it novel uses of ABA, when it should be one of the many uses of ABA that grows and grows. But what really is the problem with that? Why hasn't it taken off? And especially, it's certainly not the lack of demand, the need for it. That can't be it. So what then is the problem?
Well, I did an editorial on behavior analysis and corrections, and then I'd follow up editorial on that when I was associate editor. Mike was in charge. Mike Weinberg's great to work with, by the way. If you ever get a chance to work with one guy who's funny, who keeps you focused and organized, and says, Joe, this is a total tangent, he's the guy. Okay. And he's old now too. He's 10 years older than me, so he's got to be 65, 68 now. But we did a series of articles together on behavior analysis, and editorials on behavior analysis and corrections. Mm-hmm. And what we found is, just in general, some of it that got us out of that was the rush towards autism. Everybody wanted to go where they're going to make money, and that they're going to find a home quickly. And then the other end of that was the with the prison system, was the behavior analysts got stuck. Yates did an article, you could search the references on my article for that, where she discovered that behavior analytic procedures and behavioral procedures in general were just done to enhance nursing routines, and they were not constructive. It's kind of Wynette and Winkler did an article on this same subject, but they didn't have as much of the survey data. And they did their article in Java. But back in the same time, Wynette and Winkler were saying, wait, still quiet and docile should never be the outcome of a behavioral program for children in school. Mm-hmm. And so you saw this was a real criticism, and a lot of people that were doing behavior modification. Remember, it was a very small community back then. There were a lot of people that called themselves behaviorists, but weren't behavior analysts. They certainly weren't radical behaviorists. A lot of them were sort of, in the old days, they were more like methodological behaviors, those kinds of things. They were more behavior modifiers than anything. And they kind of rushed into cognitive therapy afterwards, because that became the next trend. But the people that were core behavior analysts have never, I remember going to ABAI, and I remember for sure, I think we broke 5,000 in attendance, and we were like all stunned that it actually happened. It was like, we broke 5,000. There are 5,000 of us. How'd that happen? Uh-huh. And now you got like 2 different conferences that go on for ABAI. I think that the BCBA board actually does its own conference too. And the state associations do their conferences. But what you're seeing is that little by little, a lot of these areas, like, for example, Fordyce, I talk about Fordyce's model because it's very big in the pain field, but it's not very big with behavior analysts. It's psychologists who've taken Fordyce's pain model, right? And Fordyce wrote in the 70s the Operant Guide to Pain Management. And it's very popular in pain management, just not with us. Actually, the biggest application today of behavioral principles, I tell people all this, has nothing to do with behavior analysis at all. It's machine learning, and it's done by computer scientists that are building reinforcement systems to get artificial intelligence to learn.
Mm-hmm.
That is probably making the largest impact on our world right now. It is machine learning, and it has very little input from behavior analysts.
That's interesting. I thought you were going to say advertising, but
actually, advertising, that's where Watson wound up. And a lot of those ideas about jingles all come from what was back then conditioning, but were back then referred to as classical conditioning or associative learning. And a lot of them are built on those kinds of ideas. But I think that there may be a day where you see computers functioning like people based completely on what was called Skinner bots back in the old Tukervy's literature out of, he worked out of University of Pittsburgh. And pretty much launched all this. He worked with respondent conditioning. He worked with operant conditioning. And how do you reverse engineer that so a machine does it? And those might be it's interesting because a greater communication with behavior analysts might bring in concepts such as rule-governed behavior, development. How do you develop rule-governed behavior, which I think could add massive amounts to the machine learning field, right? But there are many ways, and they subscribe to a very much an old-fashioned reinforcement model, with which is kind of a reinforcement old model, not a model based on the matching in the machine learning area. It'd be nice to get some of those machine learning programs to be based on a matching law. It'd be nice to. There was a behavioral linguist. His name was Esper, and he wrote in the 1920s. And Esper's work became what became later called matrix training. You can look it up on matrix training. And then finally, they started calling it recombinative generalization. But Esper's work was how do people develop language from a behavioral perspective, and how do people learn language? And his interventions, you'll still see them in Java. You'll see stuff on, but very few people understand the stimulus arrangements that were involved in creating them, the matrix training modules that were involved in training them. Howard Goldstein, no, not Howard Goldstein. No, Arnold Goldstein was in too many Goldsteins. Arnold Goldstein was in, I believe, he did the work on conduct disorders and building empathy. Howard Goldstein did the work on recombinative generalization, which was then before it was called matrix training, and how to use these matrix training modules. But we've always had a history of stimulus prep arrangements. If you look at stimulus equivalence, if you look at relational frame theory, and how these things are kind of put together and arranged, we've always had concepts of how you arrange a stimulus environment to produce behavior. I don't think as much anymore that we have a generation that is really as savvy with conceptual issues. I don't feel as though that the training, it's not their fault, by the way. It's the training programs they attend became test prep programs for the BCBA. And they did not become, now we're starting to see theoretical conceptual issues. But, back then in the early 2000s, the tests were sorely lacking on asking theoretical questions. Like I said before, you could probably hand people a test based on about behaviorism. There's a list of like 10, 12 items that are myths about behavior analysis, and find out how many behavior analysts, people call themselves radical behaviorists today, through no fault of their own, subscribe to these myths.
Yeah, they're maybe knowledgeable about producing tax and mans and other kinds of things, but the philosophy of behaviorism, like you would read in About Behaviorism or beyond freedom and dignity or other kind. They may not be that well informed about it.
Yeah, and I think they're also not so as well informed. They're good with micro models of functional analysis. But how do you extend this functional analytic process over time to produce a developmental psychopathology? We talked about conduct disorder a little while ago. Well, Patterson in '92 published an article on behavior therapy where he was using the matching law and talking about prosocial versus coercive tactics as behavioral response classes, and how a child would use those to escape parental punishment. And it is, if you go back and you look at it, the matching model reinforcement and in a naturalistic setting. And Patterson did a couple articles on that. He did an article for the Behavior Analyst today on his functional analytic model that he had done early, and then on how he moved away to the matching model for more long-term description. In the matching model, they throw out the first 1,000 to 10,000 data points as that's acquisition. They want steady state. So that's more important for what you're talking about when you talk about personality or you talk about long-term pathologies. That's more along the line where you need to go. I mean, I think one of the things that was phenomenal what Patterson did was show how you could get a stable trait of conduct disorder based on a matching model of reinforcement. And so, these are the things that I think are conceptual issues that need to be brought back into the field. And like I said, once they're gone, I mean, Jerry Patterson's passed. Now they still have Oregon Social Learning Institute, but I think even James Snyder, who did a lot of the actual calculations and did the actual data crunch and data analysis, I believe he's retired too.
What do you think about something like Cantor's interbehaviorism? Does that fit in with this overall philosophical understanding that's not being recognized?
I think Cantor's interbehaviorism is got some very interesting points to it. I'll go back to this concept of setting events all the time, which is broader than motivating operations. I always tell people that setting events are a physical setting, they're the biology of the person, they're the environment. And we've known this in behavior analysis. It's important for a long time. Bob Waller, who did a lot of work early on with children conduct disorder, showed that you can actually treat conduct disorder with very young kids by decreasing the insularity of the mother. So the mother's insularity, that's the child where he showed that you can decrease mom's insularity, get her some support groups, get some community level of reinforcement going on for mom, and the conduct problems for the child go down. Right? So he used to talk about the insular mother and her problems, right? So I think that conceptually, we're chasing down some problems now in behavior analysis, and we've always chased down problems in behavior analysis, but we shouldn't forget the problems we've chased down in the past. For example, I talked a little bit about the developmental model of conduct disorder from Patterson. Well, Patterson's model was an escape conditioning model for conduct disorder. Right. And so he looked at the escape from parental punishment or the haphazard use of punishment from parents. Bob Waller looked at the reinforcement from the parent. He looked at a positive reinforcement model. So it's negative reinforcement, escape conditioning for Patterson. Bob Waller looked at a positive reinforcement model for it. Mom gives no attention. The function of the behavior is to get that kind of attention. The kid acts out. Everybody's paying attention to the kid. And he looked at that for the development of antisocial behavior. So it's a slightly different model. They used to use the term paradigm. It's probably a misuse of the word paradigm, but it was a different paradigm in behaviorism, the escape conditioning paradigm versus the positive reinforcement paradigm. But you could see that they led to kind of different treatments. And then they converge. For example, if I go back to Patterson's model, Patterson wound up doing behavioral parent training, a little slightly different from Connie Hamp's model of behavioral parent training. Connie Hamp did a model of behavioral parent training that a lot of people who went on to do, she did if you practice parent-child interaction therapy, a lot of them use Cunningham's model. But if you go back to Patterson's model, why did Patterson wind up with it? Well, he noticed that conduct disordered children had 60, 70 different behaviors that they had, which was near impossible to treat individually discrete. So what he did was create a parent training model where now you could have the parent as the therapist, and they could go after using mild punishers like time out and response cost, and reinforcers such as praise and token reinforcers for the kid to complete chores and to do positive things. So that was the model of the early 60s, the late 60s. Well, in the 80s, Dennis Russo and Kuvo, they did an article that showed, for example, that if you take a conduct disordered child and you compliance train them, right, all these other behaviors fall out, right? So you have this idea twofold that first you have to, the only thing you can do is parent training for conduct disorder because they have so many behaviors. It's what we used to call the impossible approach because the parent's burning out. But there's some good long-term data on that. Even with adolescents, behavioral parent training's got 1 year follow-up data that's really good. Therapists burn out long before. You have to wind up recycling a lot of therapists. That was what happened with Patterson. Kuvo's model, though, became Russo and Kuvo. They did this model in where they showed, and that's actually, I think that's either in behavior therapy or it's in Java, where they showed that a lot of these behaviors co-occur. They're part of the same response class. If you target compliance, then all the other behaviors drop out. So we move from impossible to very, very goddamn hard. Right? Yeah. And then what happened was, I think that Bob Waller's group was doing stuff on, well, can we create family rules and then reinforce pro-social behavior? His had a student, Dr. Student Strand, and Waller and Strand came up with this idea. If you see it as escape behavior, and this kid is really seeking an alternative behavior of positive reinforcement, what would be the alternative behavior for escape behavior, right? Social approach. So what he did was he developed a whole program, and this was getting a lot of research, generating a lot of research interest back in the late 90s, early 2000s, on just reinforcing social approach. Now, if you just reinforce social approach, you avoid a lot of the side effects. Like Kuvo and Engelman did a book called Generalized Compliance Training. And it was a good book for outcome research and effects. But a lot of people felt the Generalized Compliance Training program was harsh. And I kind of, when I looked at it early on, I thought it was a little harsh myself. But, you know, it was a good program. It's got a lot of research data supporting it. If you go for conduct disorder kids and you want to use that program, that is an evidence-based program. And behavior analysts started going to things such as errorless compliance training as a treatment approach in the area. But then Waller came up with this idea of just rewarding, building momentum on the alternative behavior from the matching, which would have been social approach. And he showed you could get that same dropout effect. So we went from, and parents actually kind of like when you put reinforcement on social approach, but this shows a continuously developing model. In other words, it shows a model that starts out with parent training, moves to, well, you don't have to target everything, let's target compliance. And then moves to, well, you don't even have to target compliance, maybe in some cases, right? But now you can target social approach. And a lot of people find acceptability of social approach reinforcement better than compliance intervention.
Yeah.
Right? So when you talk about acceptability, treatment acceptability, you get high ratings on the social approach one. By the way, and it's something that a lot of developmental psychologists like. A lot of attachment psychologists like this idea that every time the kid comes over, you spend time with the kid instead of sending the kid away. Every time the kid asks for something within reason, you try to give it to the kid in some way. They like this idea of, building this idea of reinforcing social approach that the kid has a better attachment to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that your description that you just gave there about having a model is a good. That would be a good thing to say to parents as a description of what the program is, so they won't be so mystified. And I suspect many parents are a little bit. They have an aversive reaction when they get told, "Well, this is behaviorism, and we're reinforcing." But what you just said is it's a good step-by-step thing that they could follow and see, okay, yeah, this is something that could work for my kid.
Right, right. And I think behavior analysts have lost contact even with early literature that was very behavioral. If you go back to what Don Beer was doing in language training, with the incidental teaching program, what he developed into milieu language training, even if you are working with autistic kids, a lot of that stuff he was working with. My interest in early reflection on that was when I was working with kids in the school system. We had a lot of kids that were diagnosed with what would now be called intellectual disability, but back then it was mild mental retardation was actually what the diagnosis was back then. When you go back and you look at some of the interventions that people like Steve Warren were doing, that were like students of it, that were based on the idea of getting generalization, you find that they moved away from mass trials, that they were able successfully to do that with children, that they were able to use what we know was the technology of generalization back then and get some really good outcomes. And so that's some really good stuff to kind of go back and refresh on. But we don't even talk to our behavior analysts like Gary Hedge that were in and Marila Koenig that were in speech language pathology. That's not even covered anymore. People don't read them, and yet their work was phenomenal back then. If you go back and you look at some of those Don Beer, they used to do edited volumes every so often. If you look at some of their Warren and Kaiser's articles, and used to be Warren and Warren, then I think she married somebody else. But if you go back and look at some of those articles, they were very well designed. Now, they didn't use tax and mans. They did receptive and expressive language because they had partial buy-in to the idea that, okay, if we're going to talk to linguists who are in our department, we better speak their language as well. But they were able to put out some really good developmental models for even things like grammar. You have Sturmo and Wise, who did a good behavior analytic program for grammar development. You had Ziggy Engelman that did, from a direct instruction perspective, Teach Me Language, which was really a good program. Which was a kind of a direct instruction program, which kind of pairs rule learning with operant conditioning. That's the way he always described it.
Speaking of instruction, then you were part of the webinar Novel Uses of ABA, and your presentation was "Give me 52 behavior analysts and we can change the country. The need for do-it-yourself evidence-based mental health through streaming and television." Now, what can you, just with whatever time we have left, what can you tell us about that? Because that sounds like something to really expand it to the whole population potentially.
Yes, my argument's been for a number of years now that, okay, we've produced behavior analysts. Yes, we've been pushing licensing laws in every state, and we should continue doing that. But I think that if you think back to the old health model, you'll see that there's a universal intervention, there's a at-risk intervention, and then there's an indicated intervention at the top. That got adopted, by the way, by the PBS people, Bob Horner's group. They developed really well out. They use that as kind of their way of making sure people understand. But that primary, secondary, and tertiary intervention model goes well back to the 60s into healthcare. We need in mental health a good model that hits all three out in the public, because half the people with mental health issues do not get treatment. Some of it's because they don't trust therapists, they don't believe in therapists, or for whatever. But we have some really good skill-based training programs that we could put on to a mental health TV station. I wrote an article with Jonathan Cantor, who's a very, very bright guy as well, on functional analysis of depression. We published that article many years ago. But that article was to look at, for example, there are many different models of depression. There's a positive reinforcement model of depression. There's a too much punishment model of depression. There's a lack of rule-governed behavior model of depression. Lynn Rem did a wonderful intervention on that. If you look at Rem's self-control training, she added some cognitive elements to it. But these were phenomenal, behavioral activation being the treatment of choice for escape behavior and for things that are not enough reinforcement. Behavioral activation is a well-established treatment intervention. But these are things that are not rocket science. We can actually develop those into evidence-based videos. And we could actually put those videos on, go to the state, write up a proposal, sit with your state mental health department, say I want access to the cable channel that the state has, or can the state establish me a cable channel in its budget to do mental health TV. Now, it's a program that can kind of pay for itself, because if you want to really go over to the dark side, you could just get drug companies to advertise on it, and I'm sure they'll pay lots of money to advertise on your mental health TV station. But if you want to do that as state funding, it doesn't cost much, because a lot of these direct training programs, for example, behavioral parent training, Lynn Clark used to do SOS for Parenting, which had a lot of these kind of visual things. And there are these kinds of interventions that you can, for example, problem-solving training. You could develop a problem-solving training model, do 7 episodes on it for your web series. You could go, there are free streaming, there's Stream TV, there's even YouTube if you want to go for the most cheapest thing. State link.
I was about to say, what about YouTube, Netflix, Roku? Just put it on there.
You could put it right on there. People then could come over to the website, or they could watch it on the television station, because not everybody's on the internet. I think the numbers I saw in 2017 is about 83 to 86%. These were Pew numbers of people have the internet. I also looked it up from Nielsen and some of their subgroups. 97% of America owns TV. You know, it's interesting. I used to always tell people old technology never dies, and sometimes it just exists. There was a person that told me that, and I didn't believe it at first, there was a study that had come out that showed that millennials spend more time listening to the radio than they actually do on TV. So if you want to advertise for millennials, you might do better putting it on the radio. Well, the radio, Jesus Christ, that's 40s technology, you know? So all technology never dies. Now you just get like the AM stations. Who thought AM would have lived this long? You still have AM radio.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so you have those things. But what the idea is to put a first line of defense there that you can actually use later. For example, if somebody's in an area that has had a mass shooting, you could put out an email thing, not an email thing, what do they call it nowadays? Text to all their cell phones saying, if you're experiencing some difficulty with this, there's this coping model that we have that we could help you with. It was called stress inoculation training. It was a cognitive model. This one, it's a cognitive CBT model. It's Don Meichenbaum that did it. You can learn these coping skills for dealing with PTSD. You could become inoculated to stress if you so seek. Just click on this link, right? And then they would be right over to the TV station training you to do it. So there are things we can do that we can reach out into the public, create this idea of maybe a behavior analyst in every state, a behavioral psychologist or a behavior analyst in every state, running a television station that is state supported, that turns around and is state supported, that you're a function of the mental health department there, that you put a a board member to a board together to make sure it's not offensive to the community, because a lot of times you can get things that are, for example, a lot of people don't remember this, but behavior analysts were behavior therapists rather were really interested in a concept called sensate focus. This was before the days of Viagra, but this was to help couples reestablish their sexual relationships in couples therapy.
Okay.
Bob McCurdy, I think Bob McCree was a big behaviorist that he used to present at AABT all the time. I made a few of his workshops, but he went through this whole sensate focus technique. But obviously, that's not primetime stuff. So
some of this stuff's going to have a restricted audience, I guess.
Right. Well, that stuff would have a restricted audience, or you would have the board say, no, we're not getting into that. I mean, sexual functioning in a couple's relationship is very important, but it doesn't have, maybe that's not where we want to direct our mental health TV dollars. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of like.
I bet I know what pharmaceuticals will want to advertise on that show, but.
Oh, yeah. They'll be like cracking on it all the time, So, but you can actually make these things that are of community interest that, the little blue pill might want to sell on your station and actually fund it. It could also be funded with taxpayer dollars. The most important thing to do, though, is if you're doing this, is make sure you're using evidence-based programs. Make sure that the curriculum for them that you're using, that you're filming, uses behavior analytic models of curriculum development, because they're very superior models. It's one thing to just say this is evidence-based, but you got to have an evidence base for how you're teaching it, right? And so that's the second thing you want to do. So those are the two elements. You want to ensure you have an evidence-based mental health practice, and then you have an evidence-based method by which you're teaching it to people in the community. And then you have a place to display it. Now, the easiest place to display it is putting in a proposal with your state department of mental health and saying, I like to do this because we have a rural population that's hard to reach. I like to do this because it's expensive to have all these therapists, and maybe this will take away the need for therapy for some people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so you're looking at go ahead.
I mean, it's the possibilities are. I mean, a lot of people get court ordered to get mental health treatment and have a hard time meeting that requirement.
Sure.
With work and everything else, and this is a way that they could receive what they're supposed to have and actually comply with it and maybe hopefully get something out of it. The other thing I was going to say is the administrators of these programs then would probably be licensed behavior analysts.
I would think that they're either licensed psychologists or licensed behavior.
Yeah.
That would be my preference, because they would have to actually be a little broader than your regular behavior analyst, because they would have to be able to understand curriculum. I had a talk with Jerry Shook years ago about, this was before he passed. I had a talk with him about why didn't curriculum-based measurement find its way into the BCBA exam? And he said, well, honestly, because the exam had to be international, and a lot of places don't do curriculum like the U.S. does curriculum. We do like first grade readers, second grade readers. We do it by age group. And he said, so it would have no meaning for them. But again, that's an area. If you think of Chris Skinner's work, you think of a lot of the behavior analysts that were working in curriculum-based measurement. This was stellar work. Curriculum design, curriculum-based measurement. And you'll find that it was very helpful. When you go in there, and you wouldn't teach math by just randomly going in there and teaching math skills to kids. You would say, let me start with a curriculum on math and then go from there and see where he's having his problems. Social skills are the same way. You should have a curriculum on social skills. Like Ruth Wellington Begun, she has social skills books by age. You should have a strict curriculum in that you're using. And that's what I'm saying here. If you're going to do mental health TV and you're going to do it right, even if you're doing cognitive behavioral interventions, you need to have a training technique that gets those techniques across. Now, like I said before, Lewinson's coping with depression model. Easy model. It's a behavioral model. He started calling it cognitive behavioral towards the end of his life, but all the early stuff is lack of reinforcement. You have lots of people out there that never go to see a therapist because they have a low-grade depression and they don't want to be stigmatized. You have a way to immediately access them with mental health TV. And just think of the overuse of antidepressant medication in our society is amazing. And one of the biggest prescribers for antidepressant medication is not psychiatrists. It's actually OBGYNs followed by GPs. So what you're looking at is a lot of this, and it's not stuff they want to be doing, to be honest with you. The OBGYN and the GP does not necessarily want to be in the business of prescribing your antidepressant. They're not specifically trained on that. If you can target and market those people with the interventions that they need, you're going to have some good areas of intervention. Now, it's also a little broader, though, than just behavior analysis in general. There's a whole area. There was a journal, it used to be, it's still around, I think. You can look it up. It's called Media Psychology. And behaviorists used to publish in that. I always point to the old studies that they did on modeling for kids. They used to put them in a small group for Sesame Street. That's how Sesame Street knew it was being effective. They would do these modeling and reinforcement programs on Sesame Street, have the kids count along, and they would watch the kids in this focus group and see where they're counting, and then test them after and say, did they get something out of it? Well, that's all in media psychology. And so you need to reference the media psychology literature to start looking at things like, what's the entertainment value of what I'm putting on? I might have some great stuff, but as Dick Malott used to say, if it's not fun, it's not fun.
And I think the Blue's Clues show had a lot of they seem to use a lot of behavior analytic techniques with the repetition, the prompting,
and that probably all comes right out of the media psychology literature. I have not followed up on media psychology in a long time, but
it's fascinating.
I had an interest.
It's fascinating, the potential for it. Well, Joe, it would be an understatement to say you've given us a lot of information. Do you think maybe we could do this again sometime?
Yeah, sure. I'm always available. Whenever, like I told you, the last generations are disappearing, and part of my life is to make sure what they told us doesn't disappear with them.
Yeah.
And we're always chasing down new problems in behavior analysis, but a lot of those old problems were solved, and there's no sense in reinventing the wheel.
Yeah.
Hey, by the way, did you get those 2 links I sent you on the meta-analysis?
I've got those, and if there's more that you want to send me, I can try and put them in the show highlights. I got those 2 saved, and if there's any more, you can email or however you want to send me.
Sure. Yeah, there's lots of things to talk about. Like there was behavior analyst that worked in spinal injury, and I think of Bernie Brucker's program. And, that's a model. Actually, it's done more in Sweden than it does in the U.S. And Bernie was at University of Miami. He actually did some. Go ahead.
We were talking about couples. A lot of that stuff in marriage and family therapy, it looks very behavioral.
A lot of it was, if you go back to Neil Jacobson's stuff, who was really big in the marriage and family literature. He was the big behaviorist there. Jacobson and Margolin, they did a social learning approach to couples therapy. Then what you saw was Neil Jacobson did a rediscovery of his roots and got away from a lot of the change stuff because he wanted to reach older couples. And a lot of the stuff there is focused more on acceptance. So he developed this. Maybe the problem is we've developed too many rules model, and we need to strip away the rules to get back in touch with the